any criticism of the founding principles of the State of Israel, the actions of the Israeli government. You're not allowed to point out that Palestinians are killed and bleed as a result of Israeli government action.
We were all united in trying to create a movement which will bring Jeremy Corbyn to Downing Street. Wes and his friends, and the DUP people who were on that rally, and the Tories who were on that rally, and the people who... No, excuse me, they do not want a socialist Prime Minister.
People like you, well-meaning people like you, cannot respond to this language such as it is institutionally anti-Semitic.
I'll respond by saying it's a lie. I'm responding.
You've seen how some Jewish MPs have been treated and some of the posts and tweets.
Do you think those came from people in the Labour Party? What's the proof? There's no evidence. Lots of the people behind this whole campaign have never been out on the streets combating fascism and the far right. They're just not there. So their concern is completely manufactured, and they're attacking genuine anti-racists, which risks boosting real anti-Semitism while weakening the only force that is really capable of calling a halt to all forms of racism, which are growing, as we know. I have met those people. They specialise in going around and disrupting Palestinian meetings. I have chaired meetings at which they have catcalled and shouted and abused people. These are the people Jeremy Corbyn was talking about with that remark. And suddenly he's compared to Enoch Powell. I mean, excuse me, this is disproportionate and hysterical, and you are stoking it. It's become so difficult to be a supporter of freedom, justice and equality for Palestinians. I feel that if people like me have got a role at all, it's to continue to reinforce people's confidence that they are supporting a just cause, and that there are many, many very good ways of doing that that should not bring on your back accusations of anti-Semitism, but that we do need to learn about anti-Semitism and learn in a way that is productive and helpful to people from whatever background.
So are you the wrong kind of Jew?
It appears that I am. I mean, if you believe that that real Jews are Zionists, that they have kind of the word Zionist engraved upon their heart, then of course I am the wrong kind of Jew, because I don't share that ideology. But we have slipped into a situation now where the former chief rabbi and the current chief rabbi and people from the Board of Deputies and others will stand up and insist that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And the reason for that is that the Israeli is the collective Jew in the world, the Jew among nations, they say, and that therefore if you challenge Zionism, you're challenging the identity, the core of the identity of every Jewish person, and that of course would be anti-Semitic. So that's the logic. They call it the new anti-Semitism, and it's based on this idea that Israel has to be seen as a collectivity that represents all Jews. And so that means that Jews who do not share that perspective, who challenge it, who write or speak about it, we are definitely the wrong kind of Jew, or we're not really Jews at all. I'm Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi. I turned 70 in December 2022. I'm Jewish, I'm from a Jewish background. I've been involved in left-wing politics most of my adult life, and I am now the media officer of Jewish Voice for Labour, and in that capacity I have been elected to the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party and then expelled from the party before I was able to take up my seat on the NEC. So I grew up with a very sort of open-minded, cosmopolitan view of the world, very aware of the Jewish culture and background, because I knew where my family had come from, and I knew how vulnerable Jews were and feel themselves to be, with considerable justification, because Jewish history is a succession of persecutions, pogroms and so on. But it's not solely that. There is something called the lachrymose view of Jewish history, which sees Jews as people of being permanently and sort of universally and eternally the victims of hate and persecution. And that's not true. There's been a very fascinating and rich history, particularly in Muslim-ruled parts of Europe and the Middle East, where Jews were often able to flourish without being either forcibly converted or expelled or massacred. Though those things did happen from time to time, so we mustn't have a rosy view of it either. I'm the descendant of 4 grandparents, like everybody, and all of them were refugees from Eastern Europe, so from the Pale settlements, so Russia, Poland, Eastern Germany, and Ukraine. And they all came over, as many Jewish people in this country did, in the latter half of the 19th century. My mother's mother was the last to come. She was 3 years old in 1903, and she came from Ukraine, near Kiev. And so she managed to sneak in before the racist Aliens Act of 1905, which the famous Arthur Balfour was instrumental in bringing in, to try and prevent vermin like us from continuing to flood the country. The rhetoric hasn't changed, it's just different victims these days. So they all settled in East London, like so many Jews arriving from Europe. Many of them were in the rag trade and so on. And I myself grew up mainly in Manchester, but my parents met in West London, because by their generation, the families moved around a lot, in Kilburn, Cricklewood, and yes, it was called Menelik Road, Cricklewood. That's when they were neighbours. Their parents were neighbours. So my mum married the boy next door, and that was my dad. And their families were quite religious. Particularly, my father's father was very religious indeed. And Saturdays at their house were quite ritualistic. You know, he would go to the synagogue, and then we'd come back and we'd have a family meal, and then he would watch the wrestling on TV. I don't know if that's part of a Jewish culture. He and my dad's mother had very strong Eastern European accents. They hadn't lost them. My mother's parents were a little different. They both spoke quite proper, and they were. Grandma used to follow all the Friday evening rituals and so on, and keep kosher. Granddad was rather eccentric. He was a very creative chap, and he went off. His ideas went off into all sorts of strange places. He was left wing. He was sort of anti-capitalist, and made quite a big deal of that to me growing up as his granddaughter. So despite the sort of quite orthodox Jewish background on my dad's side, there was also quite a lot of radicalism. Dad was the youngest of 8 children, and a number of them became quite committed left-wingers, activists. My Aunt Dora was actually a member of the Communist Party, and quite a well-known one. My dad and his brother both, went on marches and read the literature, and even sort of sold the Daily Worker and that sort of thing. So I grew up with Mum and Dad, quite liberal-thinking, left-wing Jews. There are many such families in this country. I ended up in Manchester. We moved there when I was 14 from down south, and the family home was there for 50 years. Quite a few of my Jewish comrades have had to break with their families in order to take on these sort of internationalist solidarity, left-wing perspectives that they now have, including solidarity with Palestine. I was fortunate in that my background was very open to those sort of ideas. My parents were always on the left. I mean, eventually in the Labour Party, actually. They were members of their local Labour Party up in Manchester and very active. They were also involved in the anti-war movement, CND, and my dad was part of an international movement called International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And they would write letters to the papers, and we would go on demos, and there was reading material in the house about those sort of things. They travelled to the Soviet Union as well and had friends visit who'd been there. So that was my kind of lefty, intellectual, middle-class background. Dad was a doctor and Mum was a teacher after my younger brother went to school. So it wasn't that difficult for me to sort of slip into that way of looking at the world. When it came to Palestine and Israel, I certainly wasn't brought up as a Zionist, but I wasn't brought up as an anti-Zionist either. So I had in my house, like nearly every Jewish family I've ever come across, a little blue and white box which sat on the mantelpiece, where we could put our little bits of extra pocket money in there to support the Jewish National Fund and the JNF, and to plant a tree in Israel. That's what we were told we were doing. And it was only as I grew older I learned that these trees were being planted over the ruins of dispossessed Palestinian homes and communities, so that rather turned me off. But you know, that was just normal. That's what, as a Jewish family, you would have one of those boxes. And there was this, certainly on my mother's side, a sort of feeling that Jews are never safe and Israel is kind of like a safety net in case Hitler comes again. People must not underestimate the real fear in the hearts of many people, in the guts of many Jewish people. So there's this sort of sympathy for Israel. And when I was young, I'm talking the 60s, 70s, there was this idea of Israel as a sort of progressive, civilized nation in a part of the world which was very unstable. I mean, I wasn't brought up with any sort of racist, patronizing views about Arabs, but there was that view around that Israel was this oasis of civilization in a sea of barbarism. Plucky little Israel fighting off these Arab hordes who wanted to destroy the Jews, sort of thing. And also there was the idea that it was a socialist utopia. So I remember reading a book called Children of the Kibbutz, and it was all about how, you know, we promote communal living and children are brought up collectively, and it's all very utopian. That we're going to build this wonderful haven of peace and love and security in the Middle East. Nobody ever mentioned Palestinians. But then in the 70s, this all started to change because there'd been the occupation from 1967 onwards, and Palestine came to be identified with all the other struggles that were going on at the time. So, you know, solidarity with the Vietnamese. What about the Palestinians? Solidarity with people fighting against segregation in the southern states of America and the Palestinians. It just became, you know, anti-fascist movement. You have to consider the Palestinian predicament at the same time. So I gradually became much more critical of Israel. Jew does not equal, certainly doesn't equal Israeli, because most Jews don't live in Israel, and it doesn't equal Zionist either. And I did not want to be associated with the wrongs that I could see being inflicted on Palestinians by a state which called itself the Jewish state, claimed to represent all Jews in the world, and patently doesn't. So I was involved in sort of student lefty politics, anti-fascist stuff, concern about what was going on in Ireland, the Troops Out movement. I was very much involved in that. And then I became a journalist and I went and worked abroad for a bit, and I met and married a Dutch citizen of Moroccan origin. It's quite funny really, because when I was quite young at university I was involved in student politics, as I said, and there was an occasion when the Israelis had shot down a passenger jet. I'm afraid I cannot remember exactly when this was, 1971, 1972. And there was going to be a motion condemning what Israel had done, which it has already been condemned by the United Nations, but in the student union. So big debate in the main hall. Who shall we get to speak about this? Oh, we've got a Jewish comrade here. Let's see if she can do it. So my first speech. And I was probably really intemperate and very rude about Israel. And I got denounced in the local Jewish press as this obviously self-hating Jew, and people came up to me, you must have an Arab boyfriend. No Jew could say that if you didn't have an Arab boyfriend, which is ironic because at the time I absolutely didn't. I was going out with a minor son from Nottingham, actually, at the time. And then when you had 9/11 and then you had the Iraq invasion and the whole war on terror scenario, it became sort of imperative, I felt, for people like me to make some sort of public, not statement, that would be, arrogant, but just to take a position, to be clear whose side you were on. Jews who are prepared to stand up and say, we do not tolerate the Israeli state being part of this imperialist way of ruling the world, which is evidently racist against Palestinians, which is causing absolute chaos and mayhem across the Middle East and wider. The boycott movement came about as a call from Palestinian civil society. Some sections of the solidarity movement here were a bit reluctant to take it up because it was almost immediately subjected to attacks from the pro-Israel side, as this is evoking the Nazi boycotts against Jewish businesses and that sort of thing. They don't mention the fact that there was a worldwide Jewish movement to boycott the Nazi state, which was undermined by Zionists at the time. Boycott is a legitimate tactic. It's non-violent, it's a political means of raising a particular issue, of holding certain guilty parties to account for whatever it is they're doing, as in South Africa, of course. So it seemed to me perfectly logical. And like many of us, we embraced the BDS movement. Some of us set up a group called Jews for Boycotting Israeli Goods. And we had a slogan which was, it's kosher to boycott Israeli goods. This did not make us popular with some sections of the sort of Jewish establishment, as you can imagine. It was quite a cheeky slogan. But we got a lot of attention on pro-Palestinian demos because people were and still are actually amazed that there are Jews who are not 100% behind Israel. It's strange how that idea that I've been arguing against since I was 15, that all Jews support Israel, still, in fact, is getting worse because now we've got this wave of allegations of anti-Semitism against anybody who's remotely critical of Israel. It's become more difficult to sustain that clear division between people of a certain background, cultural background, religious background is often, but often not. Often it's just cultural and historical. The idea that that group of people must have a certain political ideology. You don't expect that of any other group of people. It's actually quite racist to suggest that Jews must hold this view about the Middle East. And this is what's happening. So the definition of what is a Jew and of what is Zionism and what is anti-Semitism has become an incredibly fraught issue, and it's almost entirely negative and dangerous, I think, as this thing's rolled on. And people like Jeremy Corbyn have been accused of tolerating Jew hate or being an anti-Semite himself, of promoting Holocaust deniers. I've become more and more frightened that people who are not Jewish and who are not particularly into this debate, not terribly well informed about the Middle East and so on, will just think, why are these Jews always up there? Why are we always talking about them? For the whole period that Jeremy Corbyn was leading the Labour Party, there were Jewish institutions and Jewish sort of leading members of the establishment who are Jewish and their friends who aren't Jewish, banging on about anti-Semitism all the time. And at the same time, we knew that Muslims and black people and Gypsy Roma traveller populations, gay people, trans people, you name it, were being seriously oppressed in society. Jews mainly reasonably prosperous and not discriminated against in employment or in the judicial system or anywhere that really matters in day-to-day life. But this hierarchy of racisms that has been created is incredibly dangerous, and it's generating hostility towards Jews from people who don't understand why it's happening, find it absolutely baffling and very infuriating, and it worries me. Well, the self-hating Jew thing, it's just baffling because, I don't think I hate myself any more than most people. And it's crazy because I, like most of my comrades, all my comrades, are very comfortable with our Jewish heritage. We're not apologising for being Jews. We're saying being a Jew does not mean that I have to associate myself with gross, infringements of human rights law and so on. I'm just not going to do that. There was one occasion which people might have heard of when somehow or other somebody really sick got hold of my phone number and the phone number of the co-chair of Jewish Voice for Labour, Jenny Manson, and we both got phone calls, sort of sinister, nasty phone calls from somebody saying to me, "Oh, I'm outside your door, I know where you are, I'm going to put you in a wheelchair," that sort of thing. And Jenny had something really similar, nasty. So that wasn't very nice, and it makes you worry about the kind of people who are watching you. Yeah, it's an admission of failure on their part. The fact that the people who oppose us politically completely refuse to have any discussion with us about the politics. I mean, to the extent that they will not have us invited to speak at CLPs, for example, constituency Labour parties. But they will resort to abuse on Twitter and using underhand means to try and get us suspended or expelled. And of course, for some people, this has affected their jobs, their careers. I don't know if, there probably are some Jewish people to whom that's happened, but it's happened to non-Jews. I know of a young teacher, local authority worker, councillors. So many councillors have had their whole kind of image trashed by being associated with people like us, you see. Because, if I'm a notorious anti-Zionist, then you don't want to be seen with me, do you? Since Jewish Voice for Labour was formed in 2017, we've been all the time putting forward our arguments and challenging people, particularly from the Jewish Labour movement, who are an affiliate of the Labour Party going back to 1920s, though under a different name, to debate. We say Israel's an apartheid state, you deny it. Talk to us about it. Why is Amnesty International wrong? Why are B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch wrong about this, and other Israeli human rights groups? We say that Zionism is racist. You say that it's anti-Semitic to suggest that Zionism is racist. Debate with us. Show in what way Zionism does not deserve to have that label attached to it. They won't speak to us. We're saying, and the Ford report agrees with us, that the Chakrabarti report agreed with us, and David Feldman from the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism agrees with us. If you want to educate people about anti-Semitism, or indeed any form of racism, you need to allow people to speak about what they believe, even if their beliefs are mistaken or offensive. You need to be able to say things that somebody else might find hurtful in order to then reflect on those beliefs and help people to overcome them. And that is not happening because people are terrified to speak openly about anti-Semitism. Historians will look back at this time and they will think that the Labour Party completely lost its marbles. And unfortunately, that's illness of seeing anti-Semitism in all the wrong places has spread across society as well. It's really worrying that it's taking hold in academia, where some Jewish students are able to ban the entire student body from inviting certain speakers or having certain courses or, allowing certain events to take place because they say it offends and upsets them. And you can't have Palestinians offending and upsetting people, because that's not good. I'm a member of the National Education Union, which runs regular solidarity trips to several countries, one of them being Palestine. And just before lockdown, February 2020, we had a trip organised and I went. And I must say, it was amazing, but it was very depressing, because the extent of the way the occupation and settlement is going on in the West Bank, which is mainly where we travelled, and the oppression of Palestinian citizens of Israel within the 1967, pre-1967 boundaries, it was horrifying. So everywhere you went, you saw these hillsides covered with new cranes and new build settlements, extensive ones. And every time a new settlement is built, the whole area becomes a sort of no-go zone for Palestinians. So, you know, there'll be roadblocks set up and there'll be new roads which Palestinians may not drive on. And just awful. And these Jewish-only roads where you see these tunnels where, like moles, Palestinians may be allowed to go underneath on footpaths or bumpy tracks and things. It was just horrendous. And being teachers, we met lots of other teachers, and we saw the way that school kids in East Jerusalem, their families were pretty well being driven out by constant incursions and blockades. And there's another campaign going on to cut off European funding for Palestinian education because they say they're teaching their children to hate. And that was something that we learned about on the NEU trip to Palestine, because obviously it's of great concern to teachers that they should be able to produce materials which are suitable for the kids they're teaching and which give them, in the case of Palestinian kids, a sense of their actual history rather than just being unwelcome invaders in a Zionist society. I must just say that one of the really negative outcomes of this whole emphasis on anti-Semitism and the sensitivities of Jews and how we mustn't say anything that offends Zionists is that Palestinians have been almost completely silenced. And on the left, it's become difficult to give Palestinians a platform because we're so tied up with fighting off these allegations. Obviously, one of the intentions of this whole witch hunt campaign is to just shut Palestinians up, make it difficult for them to say anything. Now, if you followed the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition to the letter, with all those examples, Palestinians would not be able to talk about their dispossession. They would not be able to talk about the racism that they faced right from the beginning of the Zionist movement. And they wouldn't be able to suggest that there was any justice in resistance, because obviously that would be, they'd be waging jihad against these innocent Jews who had done no harm. Well, at the moment, we're obviously Palestinians are facing increasing violence against them. Last year was appalling. Was it 217 Palestinian deaths? You can correct the figures for me. And this year started appallingly. We're not even out of January yet, and there have been, I think, 17 Palestinian deaths, including 4 kids. So this is not good. However, there are some signs that the inauguration of a government which is so right-wing, so blatantly racist, with actual fascists among its ranks, this has started to raise some eyebrows among sort of the liberal intelligentsia who still harbour this idea that Israel is, you know, the only democracy in the Middle East, etc., etc. So I think we can be a little bit hopeful that it might at last be possible to point out that the human rights abuses and the breaches of international law are legion and endless and completely relentless towards the Palestinians, and that Palestinians have to be supported against this, or we will witness a genocide. But I think realistically, people like us have just got to plug away at explaining the reality, pointing to the worsening situation for Palestinians and how devastating that could be, exposing the nature of this current government, but not letting liberal Zionists get away with the idea that it was all fantastic before. You know, if only we didn't have Netanyahu with his new pals, Israel would be this sort of ideal democratic state. Because that was never true. So we've got a job of work to do, haven't we, to try and make things better. And I mean, we've been saying it for a long time. The plight of Palestinians is, for our modern age, what the plight of black people in South Africa was back in the 80s, 90s. And, well, they did eventually, they rid themselves of apartheid. Obviously, it's still a society with a lot of problems. And I'm not suggesting that a one democratic state would solve the problems. It's going to be up to Israelis and Palestinians to work that out, unfortunately. Palestinians are willing, most Israelis are not.